So that is Final Fantasy X. This is inspiring for me because it's one of the first um, images that I got that helped me to assess some of the internal feelings I was having about a lot of things that was happening in society today and how things can go better. Basically, it's a story about a society that's got so advanced with its technology to where this unexpected environmental disaster comes called sin that destroys all the technology and brings everybody back to a time period where they had to exist without technology. And the game's played in that setting. And it's a very interesting thought experiment. And what it made me consider was, you know, how far are we willing to go in terms of censoring technology around our lives and our understandings of success and the lives of our children. And so I came up with something called the Rites of Inheritance of Future Generations. There's more to that backstory, but that I'll go into in the presentation. But I thought it was a cool opening. And so let's jump in. And so the objective of this presentation is to conduct an innovative multicultural longitudinal psychophysiological observational study of intergenerational wellness by examining individuals' health and healing over an individual's lifespan, their children's lifespan, and their grandchildren's lifespan. So it could total to roughly 150 years. Another objective is to establish a wellness retreat center in nature where the disenfranchised can holistically heal from modern day stressors and to learn decolonized ways of how to deal with modern problems, incorporating ideas from cultures that are not mainstream in America. And so to start, let's see, to start, we have our goals, which I basically already stated, but basically we want to prioritize and encourage our choices, values, and discussions away from individualistic instant gratification and towards long-term impacts of our society. As is stated in the Katha Upanishad, the good and the pleasant are not the same. Pleasant being instant gratification, um, and the good being long-term impacts. Or you also have in the gunas, the three gunas, you have sattva, which more so looks at long-term impacts. Then you have the name's escaping me right now. It might be tama, yeah, tamasic, those which are more instant gratification and twisted. And so the goal of this particular presentation is conduct a to conduct an example of what it would look like incorporating viewpoints from multiple cultures to examine um, many of the issues that we have in our society. And I'm calling this the multicolored ripple effect. And so some of the viewpoints that I use are Western European Enlightenment and existential philosophy, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Jungian psychology, Confucianism, somatic psychology, and even anime, amongst others. So that's a picture representing the multicolored ripple effect. And I've already went over most of this, but one thing I do want to point out is that I am declaring our society in a state of crisis. And that is largely due to the dangerous rise in depression, anxiety, stress, loneliness, and isolation. And I'm attributing a lot of that to the colonial mechanical engagement of ourselves and others and our disconnection with the metaphysical or the spiritual. And so I'll just give a little bit more backstory to where this project began. So about 10 years ago, I had what could be called a dark night of the soul, where I hit rock bottom. I got into a car crash basically, and it dislocated my cervical spine, which resulted in a lot of migraines, headaches, and vertigo. It was a very Tom Cruise and Vanilla Sky moment, and there was no diagnosis that the doctors could land on other than saying that it was in my head and that I was making it up, and trying to prescribe me a lot of opioids. This was about a year or two before the opioid epidemic, so I definitely dodged a bullet. And I had just graduated with my master's in counseling, couldn't find any jobs. So I quickly became homeless and was outcasted from a lot of my family. I was left with this book of joy that I'll go into and the Yoga Sutras to study to try to rebuild a semblance of myself, both spiritually and physically. And though it helped some, it didn't help enough. And eventually I became extremely suicidal and wrote a suicide note slash manifesto and attempted suicide right before cops detained me at 5150. Knowing that I truly wanted to die, being released from the hospital shortly after, I literally felt like I was surviving in bonus time. I then completely threw my life into spiritual practices and serving others. I would summarize or surmise that time period with the quote from Albert Camus, The Rebel, which goes, "The final conclusion of the absurdist process is, in fact, the rejection of suicide and persistence in that hopeless encounter between human questioning and the silence of the universe." So I'll let you chew on that. Um, and so I was able to reflect on the time pre getting my master's degree, right? And even before transferring to where I went to school at, and comparing basically growing up in a poor environment versus then living in a wealthier environment in college. And I was able to see for the first time in real time the difference between how stress is dealt with in society between the rich and the poor. And so this is a little chart kind of going over some of the differences. So while at CSUB, which is the school I graduated from, there was professional masseuses during final week, right, to offset stress. There was a gym in walking distance on campus and some right outside of campus. There were yoga classes available on campus and outside of class or outside of campus. There was a counseling center, healthy food options, and piano rooms. I was a piano player, so I spent a lot of hours there. And I was stressed out, just releasing it through spontaneous creation of music. And I compared it with the neighborhoods I was from, where there were liquor stores in every corner, fast food restaurants, drug dealers, and food deserts. And I thought, that doesn't seem too right. And so all of these things together helped me to, in a very real way, reimagine health and success. One of the quotes from the Book of Joy, which was written by the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, may he rest in peace, and the Dalai Lama. And this is a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and it goes, "We are fragile creatures, and it is from this weakness, not despite it, that we discover the possibility of true joy. Life is filled with challenges and adversity. And so I was able to imagine myself as more than just this person that needs to become like a perfect machine and more of, I was able to lean into my fragile nature more. And it was very empowering. And so I'm about to get into the rights of future generations. But before I do, this is kind of like an overarching theme, not Helga from Hey Arnold, but what's called the attentional pathogenic environment in Johann Hari's Stolen Focus, which is a book that extremely inspired me. And Johann Hari is an extreme inspiration for me with all of his work. And so the quote goes, the fracturing of attention isn't just causing problems for us as individuals, it's causing crisis in our whole society. We are facing a slew of unprecedented tripwires and trapdoors. And unlike previous generations, we are mostly not rising to solve our biggest challenges. Why? Part of the reason is that when attention breaks down, problem solving breaks down. Solving big problems requires the sustained focus of many people over many years. Democracy requires the ability of a population to pay attention long enough to identify real problems, distinguish them from fantasies, come up with solutions, and hold their leaders accountable if they fail to deliver them. If we lose that, and it looks like the screen cannot see at the bottom, but we basically lose our ability to make change. And so that is, I think, the overall issue happening in society right now is that we cannot pay attention due to hyper stimulation from all of the ways that we live in modern day. And so this is the rights of future generations. There's 10. And so they include things like the right to humor, the right to relaxation, the right to inherit ways to socialize, and the right to inherit realistic expectations and goals. But we'll start with the right of inheriting technology that we can navigate safely. Let me just see if I can modify this so that I can see the whole screen so it doesn't become an issue. I may not be able to. Yeah, I may not be able to. Gotta charge it to the game, as they say. Hmm. Okay. So the right of inheriting technology that we can navigate safely. Pretty important for our future generations. And so another thing on top of the intentional pathogenic environment that we live in is something known as the boiling frog syndrome, which essentially says if you put boiling frogs, or if I'm sorry, if you put frogs into water that's boiling, you just try to drop them in there, they'll immediately jump out. But if you put them in when it's room temperature, right, when it's lukewarm, then you slowly just raise the heat, then in theory, they could just boil to death. And so that is how I feel like a lot of issues are growing in our country is that it's not hitting us head on. And so as a result of that, we're not in a state of panic. And maybe we should be more, starting with technology. And so the virtual realm is a strange arena. You're able to externally interact with your mind, your ego, or as Meta literally at the tip of your fingertips without psychedelics or yoga, meditation. You don't need trip sitters, maestras, or gurus to guide you on your journey. You have a unique opportunity to deeply explore anything that tickles your fantasy. Living in a post-Victorian society, it is like having Rumspringa in Las Vegas, with seemingly insatiable curiosity, both ethically and unethically. Every fantasy or fear or plan to take over the world can be explored. Navigating the strange arena seems to have no normalized code of conduct, and the consequences of this hit children harder than adults. And so, one of the biggest shifts in our society definitely has been the smartphone, which has replaced so many things. There's a list of things on that left side of the screen. Everything from the need for TVs, yellow pages, cameras, maps, GPS devices, calculators, alarm clocks, and radios, which may seem trivial, but in so many ways, right, it's a game changer and creates an addiction because everything that we're looking for, right, all of our needs more and more seem to be compacted into this small little device. And so it's not only that that makes us like those people at the bottom of the screen, but we also can dive into rabbit holes when looking up upon different articles. There's AI and ChatGPT, right, which has, in its worst case, led people to suicide, psychosis, and AI marriages, I think. Doom scrolling and pornography. A lot of times adults say to their children that they should not overuse their smartphone, but as adults, it's something that we have not honestly figured out how to deal with ourselves. And so it's more of a do as I say, not as I do kind of lesson, which normally never works out. So our intellect has achieved the most tremendous things, but in the meantime, our spiritual dwelling has fallen into disrepair. And that's a quote from Carl Jung from Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. And basically, I think what it speaks to is this ability to tap into our lust for life and navigate controlling our own vices with no constraints. It can lead us to having a false illusion of friendship and social connection, self-induced brainwashing, and it's uncommon for long periods that are reflective to occur when somebody's using it due to the attentional due to it being an attentional pathogenic environment. And so we're going to need some adults with courage that are willing to stare this problem into the face and see what solutions rest on the other side, if we were to be honest with how big of a deal and how big of an impact it has on ourselves and on our society. And that's when the multicolored ripple effect can be helpful. So, for example, we could establish a Tao of navigating the internet. Tao, Dharma, Deen, and many similar terms seem to have as a commonality finding ways to intuit and stay attuned with healthier ways of navigating an environment and avoiding things that can compound problems. At at a baseline, we can aspire to establish how to make the internet work for us instead of us working for the internet. In a similar vein, we can work on a word called ilm, which is a Arabic word that's powerful in Islam, which means beneficial knowledge. And so we can establish a deen of navigating the internet. And so what that can look like is intentionally trying to make sure that we're not getting too much what they might call junk food, which is like doom scrolling, pornography, things like that, and spending more of our time on healthy food or things that are beneficial for us, things like researching interesting topics like places to travel or I don't know, schools to apply for. And so, yeah, essentially trying to incorporate a dean of navigating the internet or a DAO could be a good first step into trying to create some parameters that can help us not go over the edge, like the Final Fantasy clip at the beginning, and be wiped out by our own hands, essentially. But ultimately, what we need to do and what we need to incorporate more is what's called a digital detox. And I would like to believe that this would be the future of stress reduction once society realizes how bad of an impact stress has had on us and how much of that stress comes from technology. And so the trade-off of maximizing oneself through technology seems to go counter to many religious views on relinquishing the ego's hold and diving into a more divine, settled, non-material experience of the world. And so one thing that seems common in different cultures, religiously speaking, are mantras, prayer, and monotasking. Monotasking is the term I also got from Johann Hari's Stolen Focus, which I will be citing multiple times in this presentation. And so, one way to practice monotasking, which is to define it, monotasking being what it sounds like, which is just focusing on one task at a time. So, one way of practicing that is something called pratyahara, which is a word from the Yoga Sutras, which basically means releasing attention towards external stimuli and intentionally focusing on internal functions. Another example is dharana, where you focus on one pointed object. So that could be like a candle or a word in your head or a lot of different things. And so I would encourage everyone to spend 5 minutes with one of these practices, reflection or meditation. And then you have mantras or chants. And so most religions seem to memorize the religious texts from the respective religions and repeat passages. An example of that would be the Heart Sutra in Buddhism, which, you know, I'll just read it briefly. So it says, this is a quote from the Heart Sutra, translated into English. And it's this body itself is emptiness, and emptiness itself is this body. This body is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than this body. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, right? And so that's something that people in Buddhism will chant. And then in Islam, you have Surah Fatiha, the first surah of the Quran. And part of that says, the compassionate, the merciful, ruler on the day of reckoning, or ruler of the day of reckoning, you alone do we worship, and you alone do we ask for help. Guide us on the straight path, the path of those who have received your grace, not the path of those who have brought down wrath, nor of those who wander astray. And that's a picture of um, Surah Fatiha with a little Muslima writing in Arabic, which is how a lot of the art's drawn in Islam, surahs of the Quran. And so, just to recap, um, you have the boiling frog syndrome we want to watch out for. We, we have a reckoning of accepting that the smartphone has replaced a lot of things, and we're trying to deal with that with a do as I say, not as I do policy, which is not a good policy. Um, with the rise in technology in general, it has led to a rise in lust for life, exploration, and possibly developing a Tao of navigating the internet or spiritual multitasking are some things that can help us offset that. So for the second right, the right to inherit realistic expectations and goals based on realities and not perfectionism, let's just explore that some. And so this is what is expected of people in modern day. This is how we're expected to perform or to arrive each day. So we're expected to be amazing at multitasking, to be self-confident, strong, physically and mentally, punctual, stay on time, always maintain a good presentation, have good critical thinking, and be good listeners to others. And as you can see, any of these one tasks alone would be very difficult to do. The idea that we have this as a standard for living in modern day is very bold and arrogant and reminds me of the Greek myth of Icarus flying towards the sun, to be honest. And so we have too much expectation. So here goes another quote from the 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 Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama, and basically it goes, stress and anxiety often come from too much expectation and too much ambition. Then we don't fulfill that expectation or achieve that ambition. Then when we don't fulfill that expectation or achieve that ambition, we experience frustration. Right from the beginning, it is a self-centered attitude. Often we are not being realistic about our own ability or about objective reality. When we have a clear picture about our own capacity, we can be realistic about our effort. Then there's a much greater chance of achieving our goals. And so realistic expectations help us to achieve our goals. So here's another, no, here's a quote rather from book Burnout Society, which was written 2015. And it says, from a pathological standpoint, the incipient 21st century is determined neither by bacteria nor by viruses, but by neurons. Neurological illnesses such as depression, ADHD, BPD, and burnout syndrome mark the landscape of pathology at the beginning of the 21st century. They do not follow from the negativity of what is immunologically foreign, but from an excess of positivity. Therefore, they elude all technologies and techniques that seek to combat what is alien. Another problem with, in terms of unrealistic expectations, is instant communication. So nowadays, you can receive literally an unlimited number of correspondences all at the same time, and it is increasingly socially inappropriate for delayed responses, which is a big problem for many people. And so what we're experiencing is an information overload. So some quotes from Stolen Focus. Essentially, it's like drinking from a fire hose. There's too much coming at us. We are collectively experiencing a more rapid exhaustion of attention resources. We've been accelerating for a very long time, and for sure, we're getting closer and closer to whatever limits we have. Though, in my opinion, AI, such as ChatGPT, seem to further solve this process. So this is a quick video of how neurons actually work, as people might have fantasies about it, but they work at a certain speed, and so might be a little interesting to see. So it's a lot of stuff happening there, but essentially what you saw was the neurons searching for connections with other neurons and then eventually connecting when the chord progression in the background resolved to the one. And so we can examine multitasking versus juggling IRL or in real life. And so, despite what people think, your brain can only produce one or two thoughts in your conscious mind at once. That's it. We're very, very single minded. right? It's why something like monotasking is so powerful for us. What scientists discovered is that, in fact, when people think they're doing several things at once, they're actually, quote unquote, juggling. They're switching back and forth. They don't notice the switching because their brain sort of papers it over to give a seamless experience of consciousness. But what they're actually doing is switching and reconfiguring their brain moment to moment, task to task. And that comes with a cost. So here's three ways that juggling, or what we think is multitasking, degrades our ability to focus. So there's a switch cost effect. Imagine you're doing a tax return and receive a text, and you look at it, it's only a glance, taking 5 seconds, and then you go back to your tax return. In that moment, your brain has to reconfigure when it goes from one task to another. You have to remember what you were doing before. You have to remember what you thought about it. And that takes a little bit of time. When this happens, the evidence shows your performance drops, you're slower, all as the result of the switching. And so that's the switch cost effect. Then you have the screw up effect. This is also from Stolen Focus. Your brain is error prone. Instead of spending critical time doing really deep thinking, your thinking is more superficial because you spend a lot more time connecting errors and backtracking. And so you screw up a lot more. And my favorite, the creativity drain. And so where do new thoughts and innovation come from? Your mind, given free, undistracted time, will automatically think back over everything it absorbed, and it will start to draw links between them in new ways. And without the ability to free roam, such as that, there's a huge drop in creativity. And then we can look at transhumanism when combined with capitalism, which I believe creates a body overload. And this is where we want to be everything, everywhere, all at once. And so rising, there's a rising increase in unrealistic beauty standards for both men and women. As you see, here goes a chart of what an ideal man would look like in the 1980s versus the 90s versus 2000s, today, and similar for the women. Ideal woman, Marilyn Monroe in the 50s, Madonna in the 80s, and as everybody knows and loves, Kim Kardashian in 2020. So, as a quote from The Clash goes, what is the dream? To live like they do in the movies? So, this is when the multicolored ripple effect can be powerful again. And so, another word in Islam that's really powerful is sabr. One definition of that being pers persisting on the right path when under adverse circumstances, whether internal or external, personal or collective. And so I think that modernity without sabr just leads to burnout. Pursuing goals is not bad in itself, but without grounding them in reality, it can be very dangerous. For example, you can want to be great at boxing, but you need to do consistent muscle building, agility development, and cardiovascular strength, and technique development for attack and defense. In addition, you have the psychological effects to regulate, such as overinflated confidence or ego after a win and feeling worthless after losing a fight. Recovering from injury and honoring rest and recovery. Consistently maintaining this all for years with a proper coach or two can produce a talented boxer. But there are not really shortcuts, no matter how much the mind would like to find one. You being able to keep the end in sight can maintain a poise and a higher chance of follow through. This is the practice of sabr. Just gonna move forward. Let's see. So we're gonna go into the right to relaxation. And so the question being, what is relaxation? And so there's different ways of looking at it, but I'm just gonna spend a little time breaking down some somatic physiology, if you will. And so there's a window of tolerance, right, which is like known as the safety zone, the comfort zone, um, where a person is calm enough to be stimulated enough to do something. And then you can go into escalation, where the person feels threatened, or hyperarousal, when the person feels unsafe, which gets them in that flight or fight mode, rather. You also have hypoarousal and dissociation. And so relaxation would be staying in the window of tolerance. Just to go into the nervous system a little bit, some may be familiar with this. We have a fight or flight response in our body, but we also have a rest and digest response in our body. And we try to balance out our sympathetic nervous system with our parasympathetic nervous system. And this is one thing that we can look at and track in the research, which is gauging stress levels in brain waves to support healing. Uh, Depending on their autonomic nervous system level, we can quote unquote prescribe different activities that they should do on a weekly basis. Um, we can also track their level of sociability and close relationships. So that's one thing that we can gauge to help people better relax. We can also gauge people's brain waves. And so, in short, what we see is that the more time that a person spends in the theta wave section, for example, which is through like meditation and intuitive states, the more relaxed they are, the more they're in like a beta stage, right? That's like really good for going to school, for studying, things like that, playing sports. And the delta waves are only reached through sleeping, where deep relaxation happens. And so, some things that we could prescribe after assessing their brain waves and their autonomic nervous system is things that help them to get into different states. And so, an example is what I'm calling an absolute passive state or the delta state, which in theory could possibly be reached by meditation, but definitely by encouraging them to rest or sleep more. Then you have what I'm calling the subtle passive state, which is like monotasking, like pratyahara or body scan meditation, all the way up to things like what I call the hyperactive state, um, where aerobic things can happen, where a person can fluctuate between beta and gamma. I'm theorizing, and that can be activated through things like team sports such as soccer and basketball, or solo sports such as boxing, judo, and Muay Thai. And so these things would be researched and established within the retreat center, and we would look at the long-term healing beyond medication and work productivity, examining formerly shunned values and ideas, local and abroad, and rethinking progress and success from an intergenerational health perspective, as opposed to just how quickly can you recover from the moment that the original pain occurred. And so this can be further tracked through what I'm calling the three-stage approach, which I can talk about more in another video, or if you have more questions. But essentially, the first stage is the conscious stage, and that is where you learn something is bad for you to the point where you believe it, or learn something is good for you to the point where you believe it. Second stage being the knowledge stage, and the third stage being the lifestyle stage. So essentially taking something from, so a person could be eating a triple whopper from Burger King every day, and then we could try to help them gauge consciously how that's leading to heart cloggage and possibly problems in sleep, sexual performance, sociability, energy level. Um, and then they can get more knowledge about it and then autonomously make a lifestyle change, which we would not require them to decide what that is. We'd want them to organically reach that place. We don't expect that to happen overnight, as many of those actions don't last when people try to change up their lifestyle. Instead, it would be desired that, um, yeah, the person incorporates it into their life as they see fit. And so, one example of going from generational poverty to generational wealth is my grandmother has diabetes. My mom is pre-diabetic, and none of her kids have diabetes, right? So instead of just looking at one person within their lifetime, tracking it over multiple lifetimes. And this is encouraging because there's a lot of despair in society, and there's a lot of worry because there hasn't been more action done sooner. And maybe with the exception of climate change, apparently, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now, which is a Chinese proverb that we could really hold on to, especially in modern day. And so, recapping this very long section, um, we have too many expectations. We have too much instant communication, and we're that results in us being overloaded with information. We think we can maintain it by multitasking, but as we've learned from scientific study, we don't have the capacity to multitask. And what we actually do is juggling and switching, um, which leads to things like creativity drain and screw up effect. And so incorporating things like the Islamic or the Arabic rather term sabr, which is popular in Islam, can help us by maintaining more patience. We have the five wealths that I didn't go over, which is physical health, emotional, social emotional, rather, spiritual, mental, and financial, which we'll get into a little bit. Um, one of the one of the priorities that we should put at the top of the list of what's important in our society in modern days, physical relaxation, where I showed how we could examine somebody's level of relaxation from looking at their autonomic nervous system. And if they're more in a rest and digest state or fight or flight state for longer periods of time, and also examining brain waves, and then establishing a retreat center where people can, in a safe environment, right, particularly the disenfranchised and those most impacted by all of the things happening in this colonial society, they can do things like work on, like try out monotasking or meditation or sleeping more or engaging in different activities such as Muay Thai, right? And really expanding out the benefit of doing this from not just one person's individual lifespan, but from a generational wealth perspective, which includes things like the three-stage approach. So that was the most thorough and longest section of this whole thing. So I appreciate you staying focused, not letting the attentional pathogenic environment throw you off too much. Speaking of environments, we have a right to inherit healthy recovery environments, which is what I'm calling. And so it's important to name that we want the retreat center to be in nature because there's a lot of benefits to being in nature. Even looking at this picture, right? And seeing the green and the mountains and the skies and a reduced amount of our own building is very powerful for the mind and relaxation. And so doing something that one of my professors in the East West Psychology program um, named Earth Time, which is more of like a primal conscious. And so establishing a personal ecosystem of the self, we transition from clock time to earth time by slowing down and immersing ourselves in our animal bodies to open the channels of inner communication. When the natural world is out of sight and mind in these days of high-speed technology, sedentary workplaces, and manufactured urban suburban sprawls, it is easy to lose our ground and our somatic connection to the planet. How can we revisit more often the primal consciousness that reminds us of our place in the larger body of life? And so this is an example of forest bathing on the right, which is a healthy way to connect with nature. Mother Nature will become the main protagonist in your story. She would bestow her favors, teachings, moods, signs, and symbols on her life. Regardless of how you might perceive her, you would hear her wisdom voice in a hawk, fox, rattlesnake, beetle, coyote, raven, mosquito, and all her creatures. She would show you other ways to get warm, to cool yourself off, or to find shelter, which is a quote from Stephen Foster, who I was inspired to do a wilderness recipe passage from, and has done really great work, and may he rest in peace as well. So to finish this section, or to get closer to finishing this section, some benefits of biophilia or being in nature is reduced anxiety, improved mood, improved energy, improved sleep quality, improved cognitive performance, reduce pain, reduce stress. And so really trying to center the retreat center around a biophilic centered environment is crucial because it offsets a lot of the problems that we've already been stating. And so it's very powerful and very central. And so essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to rediscover civility. And so here goes a quote. Before our white brother came to civilize us, we had no jails. Therefore, we had no criminals. You can't have criminals without a jail. We had no locks or keys, and so we had no thieves. If a man was so poor that he had no horse, teepee, or blanket, someone gave him these things. We were too uncivilized to set much value on personal belongings. We wanted to have things only in order to give them away. We had no money, and therefore a man's worth couldn't be measured by it. We were really in a bad way before the white men came. And I don't know how we managed to get along without these basic things, which are told are absolutely necessary to make a civilized society, which is a quote from Lame Deer from a book called Seekers of Visions. And he is Blackfoot, part of the Blackfoot tribe, Native American tribe, indigenous tribe, which inspired Abraham Maslow to, as we learned, incorrectly create the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so the question is, what is the fear? Is it to live like they did in the past? To literally go get out of the frying pan of technology and into the fire of nature? I don't know if we can afford to maintain that fear. As charts have shown, our productivity has consistently grown in our society, whereas our income has stagnated. And so we've been trying to maintain the lifestyle, but either because of greediness of CEOs or the hyper belief in the free market system or individualism or all the many other things that people attribute to modern day problems, it's just untenable to maintain this, whether we are scared to face that reality or not. And so, one thing that creates, particularly amongst the poor, is a perpetual state of desperation to try to perform at the level of those who are quote unquote winning or succeeding. And one way that's looked at is through something called the strain theory, which argues that crime occurs when there aren't enough legitimate opportunities for people to achieve the normal success goals of a society. In such a situation, there is a strain between the goals and the means to achieve those goals. and some people turn to crime in order to achieve success. And so this is what we're dealing with. These blurry pictures, the one on the left is we have homeless encampments. And just a few months ago in the Bay Area, this picture was taken of a homeless encampment shut down. And in the same area, you have places like abandoned warehouses where people are unable to live due to private property laws. And so there's a lot of things just kind of going awry in our society, and we have to look at that. This is not the 1950s. The 1950s is often viewed from a rose-colored glass effect as well. And so, in short, to recap, we have a right to inherit healthy recovery environments, and particularly, if not us, then our children and our grandchildren. And this can be found best by biophilia or biophilic environments, which the retreat center could be set in nature, where a person could activate all of those healing benefits. And we can rediscover civility, right? Again, going back to that Final Fantasy intro, not feeling like the only way to progress is by diving deeper into technology and being efficient, but also looking at how helping others and redistributing wealth is beneficial and not created at all by socialism, right? But knowing that that's just how many tribal societies, not just the Blackfoot tribe, practiced. And we don't necessarily have the luxury of just holding off longer because we have a rise in homeless encampments, particularly in urban metropolitan areas. And you have families of people of who I work with, as I've been in the helping profession for the past 20 years, who are sleeping under bridges and outside of abandoned warehouses because we feel like that's what's going to create the best society. And I think that deep down, we don't believe that increasingly. Another thing that we have that our children should have a right to inherit is the right to inherit safe and benevolent language to socialize with community members. And so this is a quote from James Baldwin at the bottom. Not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so you have this word from the Akan people of Ghana, which uh, is a word to represent that I'm not going to butcher the pronunciation of, but the picture on the right essentially is two crocodiles, if you look at it, laying on top of one another. And the picture symbolizes, despite their conflict over food, the crocodiles must cooperate to survive, highlighting the need for unity and democracy. And so in our society, we're not just dealing with individual stressors within our body due to technology and unrealistic expectations. We have untangible knots, unforgivable offenses, which lead to social and intellectual analysis paralysis and encourage the skyrocketing of unprocessed material to remain in the shadow of the individual and collective psyche. And so that can all be summarized as the American culture wars. And so we have a mounting backlog of societal problems that cannot be resolved within the space of scientific management, which is a term coined by Friedrich Taylor, the father of scientific management, who pioneered the systematic study of work processes focusing on optimizing individual tasks and workflows to maximize output, aka how we live day to day today. So no, it's not. It's not innate within us, right? This was actually a man-made idea. And so we have a whole bunch of karmic debt building up. Currently, we may have destroyed the possibility of peace in regards to racial, economic, gender, and many other term populations due to mass destroying of civilizations and being unable to establish peace and sufficient accountability to move on. And that's something we have to sit with. There's been a lot of things done. Um, and so the way that I'm conceptualizing our society today is inspired by my exploration of Confucianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam at the outset of how they were established. And I broke it down into possible phases of developing societies, which are five different phases. Phase one, which is the Jahiliyyah phase or the age of ignorance. Phase two, the 100 schools of thoughts, which eventually transfers into stage three, which is the Tower of Babel, which eventually leads to stage four, which is war, and then centralizes with five, which is a centralized thought. And then the cycle just repeats. And so on the next slide, I have a breakdown of how I think that this is looking at societies since the 1960s. And so if you look over at the bottom right corner, you have phase one, which is the Jahiliyyah period, which I'm going to call the civil rights era. You have phase two, which is 100 schools of thoughts, which I will go into in depth very soon, where you have a whole bunch of basically philosophies on the best way for us to live. You have phase three, which is Tower of Babel, or the American culture world we have, where everybody's scapegoating at somebody else. And I believe that we're in stage four right now, which is a war phase, but incorporating the South African idea of Ubuntu and taken from the book of Forgiving by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter. Um, we can go into a revenge cycle, or we can go into a forgiveness cycle. Going into a revenge cycle will lead us into phase five, which is centralized thought, which was colonialism. So in a way, it led to the civil rights era. And so to go break down the 100 school of thoughts period a little bit more, what I did was I took the top five books out of, I believe, 10 of the key philosophical theories that we use in our society today, and I counted how many pages a person would have to read to have their own understanding from a Kantian, what is enlightenment view, right? Of having the courage to use one's own reasoning and actually engage intellectually in the culture war. And so you have the critical theory, you have the feminist philosophy, environmental philosophy, logical positivism, postmodernism, posthumanism, hermeneutics, human biology, structuralism, existentialism, psychology, and sociology, right? And so these are actually five of the main books. And to read all of those books, you'd have to read 22,680 pages. Um, and I have the top five concepts from each of those books to further illustrate how we see these themes in movies and political debates, and dating dynamics, and then beliefs about the future and beliefs on being healthy and so many different things. And so, for example, you have in feminist philosophy, you can learn about patriarchy, intersectionality, gender performativity, the male gaze, and epistemic injustice. Um, whereas people are just expected to know these very complex concepts. Another example would be with human biology. You'd have to learn about anatomy, physiology, genetics, evolutionary adaptations, and homeostasis. And sociology, which is used all the time. You would have to understand the concept of social structure, social action, cultural capital, power and authority, and social institutions. And of course, none of these books or philosophies necessarily adapt into or conform into one another's schemas. And so You have what I'm considering a Tower of Babel that occurs, where a person who tries to pull out one of the concepts to understand it, like the game of Jingo on the left, can be in fear as everything starts to fall, even if there's people laughing on the sidelines. Another problem we have is the battle between old and new. And so there's a gap between the very well read and those who have access to AI technology like ChatGPT that can navigate insanely large amounts of information that could take decades to learn about and assimilate. Um, and so this is another issue that we see in modern day. Another issue that makes socializing harder is we've handed over social responsibility for security passwords. We've lost the ability to form deep connections with others, which involves more risk and vulnerability than we are capable of extending to others for a long time, throughout them falling short and failing at their job of being perfect friends or confidants. From my experience, there's an actual transformation that occurs with one or both individuals when deeper connections are established. So, some characteristics needed to develop trusting, intimate relationships, self awareness of one's strengths and growth edges, and the willingness to think collectively or objectively. And so, genuine friendship is entirely based on trust. If you really feel a sense of concern for the well-being of others, then trust will come. That's the basis of friendship. We are social animals. We need friends. Scientists have also found that we need love to survive. And so, leaning into genuine friendship, leaning into trust, and leaning into the idea that we're social animals can really help us to improve our ability to socialize. And then you have the idea of revenge versus forgiveness, which was mentioned in stage four. And so this is a chart taken from the Book of Forgiveness, where you have the what's called the revenge cycle versus the forgiveness path, or the fourfold path of the forgiveness cycle in response to hurt, harm, and loss. And so uh, here's a quote from the Book of Forgiving, rather. Forgiving does not condone an act. It is not about turning a blind eye or letting them off the hook. Forgiveness is simply about understanding that every one of us is both inherently good and inherently flawed. Within every hopeless situation lies the possibility of transformation. And so I'm proposing as a substitution for centering ourselves around demographic informations like race, gender, and economic status, considering centering ourselves around our personality types and cognitive functions, which is taken from Carl Jung's personality types. And so, estimation, the attempt to bridge intersectional divides has been more of a failure than a success. And so, we have an extreme amount of intersectionality happening, from ability to gender expression, political affiliation, sexual orientation, nationality, race, gender identity, personality, age, culture, physical health, ethnicity, education, marital status, location, occupation, class, religion, and language. And this is a quote from the Dhammapada, which is a Buddhist text, and it's better than 1,000 useless words is one useful word, hearing which one attains peace. And so, for example, many people I've worked with in juvenile hall have extroverted sensing in their dominant function. And so attributing that to uh, their behavior as opposed to first looking at their race or their gender or their class. As well, many clients I've worked with in counseling, as a counselor, have introverted thinking or introverted feeling in their dominant function, or extroverted intuition in their dominant function. And so looking at that rather than just calling them crazy or weird, right? I believe the impetus of these assumptions are pure, and humans attempt to categorize their environment to operate smoothly in nature, but it fails horribly and often. The last example I didn't mention was many women that I've heard referred to as bossy, which, is very bothersome for them, of course, have extroverted thinking in their dominant function, which just doesn't have any negative attribute to them. And so just trying to find words that bring peace as opposed to trying to find like perfect. And so some benefits of using cognitive functions as a political solution to the cultural war. One is it doesn't require prerequisite knowledge unless you go into deeper things like the eight function stack, founded by John Beebe, or the Four Sides of the Mind, which was created by C.S. Joseph. Um, So yeah, but as core cognitive functions rules out elitism, where a person has to read all of those books that I had shown and get all the 22,600 and whatever 80 pages down. Um, it's not based on social class, and so it's a post-caste system, which most societies have not been able to achieve, if not all. And it allows for the inclusion of all variations of personality types having a place, which can create an organic solidarity as opposed to a mechanical solidarity, which is a term coined by Emil Durkheim, the founder of sociology, and it transcends race, gender, age, and other demographic categories that fuel this cultural war. And so, to quote Dr. King, I will look to a day when people will not be judged by their color of skin, but by the content of their character. It's essentially an opportunity to dive into that and trying to actualize that. And the cultural war can just be seen as a thing of the past. Next up, we have the right of inheriting safe and benevolent language to social. Well, no, this is actually a recap. So just to recap, the right of inheriting safe and benevolent language to socialize with our community members. You have the Ghanaian symbol, which says that crocodiles, in order to survive, must share with each other. Without that, you have culture wars, which we increasingly cannot afford to deal with due to the amount of karmic debt we have, due to just the destruction of so many civilizations. Um, it's possible that we're in what I'm considering stage four of developing society, which is after the Tower of Babel, where we can choose the revenge cycle, which leads to war, or the forgiveness cycle, right? Incorporating more of the Ubuntu idea of I am because we are. Um, we've lost social responsibility and we've substituted that for security passwords, which I believe started during the Patriot Act period, which I didn't touch on, and possibly trying to incorporate cognitive functions over demographics. These are some things that can help us to inherit a safe and benevolent language to socialize with our community members again. We're about halfway through, so the right of inheriting adults with integrity is important as well. And so, one way this can happen is through people doing shadow work, which is a Jungian idea. So, here's a quote from the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. If we are able to see our own shadow and can bear knowing about it, then a small part of the problem has already been solved. Many do not like to be reminded of this, but prefer to think of themselves as heroes who are beyond good and evil. And so what we have today is we have grifters, which are modern day sophists. And so people have and are still trying to perfect the art of making people do things that they don't want to do. Some ways that grifting is normalized in our society. You have advertisement, which is highlighted beautifully in the manufacturing consent by Noam Chomsky. You have political ad campaigns and lobbyists, grocery stores and fast food, which have things like the deceiving pictures on the right or labels on the right. You have video games like Call of Duty, which encourage violence, but we say we don't. There were anti-violence or anti-war. You have normalized predatory lending, and you have grifting done at work, which is famously shown in the show Severance, that's seen in Apple TV, and many other things. And so, some of the problems with sophistry in modern day: one, it's cruel. It promotes win-lose scenarios, often for personal short-term financial gain or power, at the expense of long-term loss or trauma of another, with little to no accountability or self-reflection on the karmic effects, personally to the other person or to the society. It's also often used as a mean to run from or feed one's own insecurities or vices, perpetuate one's clashes, and avoid having to confront one's shadow mirror, as opposed to pursuing one's Tao, Dharma, or Deen, cleansing one's spirit and cultivating pro-social virtues to be able to adapt to the world. Another problem with sophistry in modern days, it's exploitative of another's weakness, innocence, and ignorance. It's manipulative, leaving people confused of who to trust and what to believe. Often involves withholding knowledge to maintain control over another's ignorances. It's a sleight of hand performed best by magicians, not musicians, and its qualities we don't wish for our children to inherit ultimately. We are social beings. When deception is presented from one person to another, it plants a seed for enemies at war. When fairness is offered, it plants a seed for fairness to grow. From the Confucian perspective, this is worse when people in power operate from this approach, namely parents, governmental authority, or teachers. So you have the Zhao Ren versus the Junzi, or the lesser man versus the good man, which is beautifully illustrated in the Confucian Analects. So this is a quote from the founder of um, CIIS, which is the school that I attend. The educational system, as it operates today, does not take into account the whole person, nor does it take into account the whole world. CIIS and the East West Psychology program in general seem to be founded on being its antithesis. And so we have to look at ways to model healthy adaptation. And so these are some things we can reflect on. And they're not easy, but they're helpful. How do I deal with hurt or loss, pain, betrayal, lust, anger, pleasure, joy, work, rest, other cultures, people with differing views, people of a different gender than me? We live in a country that lives almost in a medieval bifurcation of good and evil, and everything is reduced to that story. That's a quote from Richard Wolff, from an interview he did earlier this year. And so that's going to introduce me to what I'm calling the Malcolm X fallacy, which should help us make sure that we have adults who um, move with integrity. And so, what is the Malcolm X fallacy? The Malcolm X fallacy occurs when someone confidently makes an anti-intellectual disregard for an individual or group due to presuming them to be unworthy of learning about, or from often based on ethnicity, religion, gender, or other easily accessible signifiers. Most importantly, if a person cannot give a fair and accurate account of a person or group's central beliefs or practices, they then they do not have logical grounds for declaring them unworthy of learning about in order to find solutions to modern issues in society. More importantly, it cannot be declared that they are quote unquote good or bad. One of the biggest signs of human ignorance, in my opinion, is to destroy something that you don't understand. This is one of the most consequential sins of colonialism. Examples of quote unquote bad people: Carl Jung, Confucius, rap music, and Black people in general, all places deemed by colonists at the time to be not worthy of learning from, commonly termed, commonly termed indigenous cultures. Examples of what we consider good in our society is logical positivism and falsifiability, capitalism, respectability politics, and individualistic independence. And so what you have is a distortion of who's evil based on American values. Tupac, which if you look at his life, right, was a political revolutionary who fought for the rights of people and would sometimes play on the stereotype of how he's perceived as a black man. Whereas on the other hand, you have a popular modern day show, You, which they look like the ideal American, but morally speaking, right, for anybody that's seen the show, without giving away too much, Joe and his wife are very evil, straight up. And so being able to see beyond race and gender. Uh, Final thoughts on the Malcolm X fallacy. Some benefits to examining more things from a Malcolm X fallacy lens. One is that it greatly improves intercultural relationships by countering the othering process. Another is we could reach a more accurate, universally agreed upon conclusion that we have exhaustively researched all the ideas impossible and people possible to find solutions to the modern problems we face. And the third is we promote a more healthy use of one's intellect, grounded in discovering a more well-rounded way of living instead of just doom scrolling. Another thing that's important for establishing adults with integrity is people saying, I don't know more. It's a phrase that's unfashionably gone out of style. The scientist, the priest, the philosopher, and the king all don't know what the deepest truth is, what our true purpose is, or even if we have one at all. This is another reason why humility and integrity are so important. And so I'm taking a quote from a scientist, a philosopher, a religious person, and a king to illustrate the point. And so this is from a scientist. If you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. The next quote is from the Katha Upanishad. Nachiketa said, there is this doubt about a man when he is dead. Some say that he exists, others that he does not. This I should like to know taught by you. This is the third of my boons. Yama, the god of death, responds, on this subject, even the gods formerly had their doubts. It is not easy to understand. The nature of Atman is subtle. Choose another boon, O Nachiketa. Do not press me. Release me from that boon. And then from a philosopher, this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau from Discourse of Inequality. Our new grammarians began to extend their ideas and generalize their terms. The ignorance of the inventors must have confined this method within very narrow limits. And as they had at first gone too far in multiplying the names of individuals from ignorance of their genus and species, they made afterwards too few of these from not being considered beings in all their specific differences. And finally, from the book of Ecclesiastics, King Solomon said, I devoted myself to search for understanding and to explore by wisdom everything being done under heaven. I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. I observed everything going on under the sun, and really it is all meaningless, like chasing the wind. And so these are all people that have dove very deeply into the deepest depths of existence and understanding and have stated essentially that I don't know, that they don't know. And um and yeah, it's really healthy. And so one way that we can practice this is through examining the Black American population. In modern day, it seems that many races are expected to have unreasonable insight into the Black experience. Unreasonable primarily because Black people have not processed things enough as a collective amicably. There needs to be an emic study done where Black people can examine how successful were the Great Migrations, for example, and what were the pros and cons. In the Great Migrations were when the Blacks, for the first time, fled in the millions from the South to places like New York, Chicago, and Oakland. Um, as well, other topics that we have never discussed as a groups, as how to like such as how to function as Black men and women together in this society, or what does the family structure look like when not defined by other cultures but our own, or and I believe that underground rap music is by far the most complex and emic analysis of all of these things. As a side note, when we allow for admitting when we don't know something, benefits can overflow, including healing within smaller groups, which has a ripple effect ultimately of healing as a nation as a whole. Other topics that can be explored are um, things like homeless encampments and places around the world impacted by colonialism, like India, Brazil, the Caribbean island, and Congo, to reduce and maintain a bravado about having all of the answers and allowing for us to move with integrity in our healing. And so this is an example of emic knowledge of being a poor Black male in America. And so examining the social strain theory, anomie by Emile Durkheim, colonization, the Great Migration, and redlining. There's a quote from Freestyle by Joe Budden, 2009, where he says, I wear a K as a weapon, eye through the scope, in case my foes at the top of that stairway to heaven. I never cared, I was careless, I feared being afraid, or maybe I'm afraid of being fearless, or feared being fearless but fearful. So even in my carelessness, gotta be careful. Another great example of this is Jordan Lucas. Jordan Lucas's Ross Capiccioni, or anything written by the famous Black Dog. And so, in summary, the right of inheriting adults with integrity involves adults doing shadow work and looking at some of their darker sides, calling out grifters, which are modern day sophists, looking at healthy ways of adapting to things like hurt and loss and betrayal and people from different cultures, establishing a Malcolm X fallacy logical standard when choosing who to deem as useful or useless, good or bad, and allowing for emic studies of things like how successful were the Great Migrations for Black people, which allow for other cultures to say that they don't know because Black people ourselves have not explored it enough. So getting closer towards the end, another right is the right to ask existential and ontological questions, right? And this will allow for us to transition from a closed to an open society. And so really allowing for the teacher to be a self-actualized healer and centering around uh self-actualized healers being teachers. And so an example of this would be another quote from the Confucius Analects, which says, the master said, do I have knowledge? I have no special knowledge. But if an uneducated fellow comes to me with a question, I attack it with all sincerity, exploring it from end to end until I've exhausted it. You see this level of servant leadership, humble type of approach in people like Jesus, Bell Hooks, Krishnamurti, the sacred bath idea in psychology, Daniel Lip, and Thich Nhat Hanh. And so, why leave our children to play hot potato with our messy adult problems? We cannot leave the hardest issues in societies left up to the youth to solve. This conflates natural curiosity with negative consequences, where kids might ask questions like, why do we celebrate Thanksgiving if it has a strange history? Why are there so many poor people? Why is violence punished, but in all the video games and movies we play? What is a black man? What is an Indian woman? We should not live in a society where our young can ask a plethora of questions that even in adulthood we have cowardice about, leaving our youth to wrestle with deep philosophical questions with no guidance from adults. Existential questions innocently trample over hardened stereotypes and mental walls and dogmas held by us. Because as we all know, kids can say the darndest things. And so it's going to take courage on our end. And another quote from the Confucius Analects is a youth is to be regarded with respect. How do we know that his future will not be equal to our present? And so there's a further exploration of the multicolored ripple effect. And so in conclusion, you should have a right to ask existential and ontological questions. We should centralize teacher as self-actualized healer and could not punish children for our own cowardice. We have a right to inherit ways to socialize. And so this is looking at American archetypes, and a concept in the Confucian Analects called Li. And so here goes another picture from the Ghanaian people. And this is the famous Sankofa, which means return and get it, looking at the past to understand how to deal with things in the present. So I'm just going to skip forward. So what is Li? Li or rights refers to the importance of proper conduct and behavior in social interactions. It involves understanding and practicing the appropriate etiquette and customs for various social situations. For example, in America, we tend to hug family members or people very close to us instead of shaking hands. I believe capitalism is the main prescriber of rights in our country, which echoes sentiments of Noam Chomsky's classic manufacturing consent, where he basically states that we establish cultural practices based on advertisements as opposed to advertisements, or as opposed to just establishing it based on cultural norms. We can bring many rituals currently practiced into our consciousness by speaking more directly to their occurrence. This has the potential to counter rising social anxiety, isolation, and doom scrolling. Um, Here's an example of some American ceremonial activities. So you have people playing video games, going to theme parks, watching movies like Higher Learning, and playing Minecraft even. I would posit that activities like these, um, that we celebrate have spiritual and symbolic meaning of celebrating the advancement of technology and how we can be amazed by its abilities. Increasing point of pride in America since the American Revolution. These need to be promoted to more than just traditions, activities, and to more accurately engage in what's happening, in order to accurately engage in what's happening in society. We don't like to talk about this as such, but we do seem to have identifiable archetypes, rituals, and ceremonies in America. Capitalists seem to be the only segment daring enough to engage in this topic, and it is destroying our country as a result. If there's no other way to find peace and genuine community in this country, then tapping into the undeniable American collective unconscious can be a powerful starting point. I believe that they have the potential to aid in the de-isolation and increasing separation of the American people. And so on the left is a picture of Michael Jackson. um, showing why he's an American archetype, essentially. Or let's see if I can find someone else's page. I'll stay with this. Just a little clip of Michael Jackson being great and changing our society and maybe in some ways the world. We also have good old Clint Eastwood in the corner, who I would consider an American archetype. But you also have people like John Coltrane, who has a church dedicated to him in uh, San Francisco. And the final example I'm going to give is Iggy Pop and the Stooges. So this is a little clip from their song "The Passenger" from the 1970s.
Carry me off the bus.
Iggy Pop is definitely an American icon or archetype. And you also have the trickster archetype with people like Richard Pryor that was able to shed light on a lot of racial divisions and break through a lot of uncomfortable topics, and George Carlin, who looked at a lot of social inconsistencies. Um, and so here to look at archetypes in a collective archetype case study, I have Naruto that we're going to look at, which was originally written in 1999 and has taken over America by storm, though founded in Japan. I still think it's a really good example. Um, and so within Naruto, I think some of the reasons why it has such a appeal on our collective unconscious is, for one, is it seems to look at the Superman or Ubermensch concept from Nietzsche, which is quoted as, and here's a quote about that, which is man is a rope stretched between animal and Superman, a rope over an abyss. And so, um, yeah, so Naruto's story is essentially a story about Superman, taken from Thus Spoke Zoroaster or Zarathustra. The story is more relatable also to the human experience than many superheroes in the West. And also, you dive into topics of human tragedy, where you look at things like good guys turning bad, bad guys turning good. It justifies suicide, rationalizes genocide, makes you see people making extreme sacrifices for family and friends. You see many cases of orphanage, loneliness, rage, hatred, psychosis, sexuality, fighting in war when it's justified and when it's not, hierarchy, like the Confucian Five Relations, corruption, the pain of character development, manipulation, deception, and exploitation. In a society where many things in adult life contradict the moral values expected of children, and many discussions are left undiscussed intergenerationally, it allows for a place where kids can process deep societal issues alone and with their friends. And art also beautifully looks at takes a lot of religious concepts from things like Buddhism and Hinduism, where it explores chakras, Tenketsu, rebirth, Reiki, and meditation. And also looks at things from Taoism, like Neji in the corner doing the 64 trigram palm. So you have like the eight trigrams, Qi, Yin Yang, cultivating and harmonizing with nature. And then you have ideas like from Shintoism, right, which is a Japanese religion in a sense. And you have things like the sun goddess Amaterasu and Confucianism as well. And so for the last section of this, kind of like a journey into the non-intelligible experiences. And so the last right I want to touch on is humans have a right to humor and funk. And so this is partly inspired by the paradoxical theory of change, which one person has quoted as change occurs when one becomes what he is, not when he tries to become what he is not. Change does not take place through a coercive attempt by the individual or by another person to change him, but it does take place if one takes the time and effort to be what he is, to be fully invested in his current positions. So both funk and humor seem to exist inside the social tension between societal expectations and self-expectations and inner parts of the self. And so this is a really complex idea, but essentially I've mapped it out where I take the concept of active participation from Daniel Lipp, Goethe's participatory method, music and language, and Parliament funkadelic mythology. And so the two on the left come together to create soul connection through music, and the two on the right, or vice versa, create active participatory method. And I come up with what's called the Clinton's active participatory method. And so, just to briefly describe the Goethe participatory method, um, there's a participatory relationship between the organism and their environment, such that the outer world calls for the inner world, and they meet and participate with one another. And so that is taken from Footnotes to Plato, brief description of active participation. Indigenous knowledge systems require active participation between humans and their environments. Participation is a lifelong process that is carried out daily. At the core of individual knowledge systems are relationships established through hands-on learned experiences based upon respect and reciprocity between humans and their environments. And that's something from Daniel Lipp. And so what you're seeing is a theme of people trying to interact with more than just technology, and more than just their fantasies, but actually other people in real time, other thoughts they have in real time, and nature in real time. And I'm really digging that idea. This is too complex to go over, but I'll see if I can briefly do so. So essentially, there seems to be a portal into our deeper meaning for being alive, which seems to be a gateway. So human sound and language seem to be a portal into our deeper meaning for being alive. Seems to be a gateway which activates the mind's ability to interpret meaning. Two good examples of this seem to be music and language. Music with its harmonic effects in particular, without the need for words, always activates feelings and often incites one into movement, for example, dance. Um, and so if you check out Yeba's Tiny Desk first song, which I believe is called Stand, which is right here, then I would think that's a really good example of it. I'll just play a part of that, just the so you could have the experience of feeling something without needing logical explanation to establish the connection.
You are the light of my world. Don't need to try so hard. Dreaming of time on told you. So don't you make me say it one more time. Like when you went away, moonlight took the day, stars and darkness. Oh, 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 collided in the loneliest of space. Will you Will you stand? Can you stand the rain? Yeah, baby. When summer's gone and there's no use in weighing it out all the time, all in vain. Seeping deeper into blame when you went away. Moonlight took the day, stars and darkness, oh, collided in the loneliest of space. Will you stand, or will you fall?
Hard to turn that off, but yeah, that is Yeba, it's Tiny Desk concert, a little sample of it. And I want you to reflect on how did you feel, right? How did you feel somatically hearing that? Did you feel like you needed logical words to explain? Why is it that there's things that we can understand that don't involve logic? And so just diving into those portals of our nature. And then finally, we have Clinton's participatory method, which is looking at George Clinton, which was, which is, or he recently passed away, so may he rest in peace as well. George Clinton tapped into, or maybe he didn't actually, so I apologize too soon. So George Clinton tapped into all the collective archetypes individually and through his band, centering around tapping into funk, the mysterious internal starting point that motivates humans to create or humans to dance, create, and connect with others. I would consider funk on par with the abstraction of concepts like the Taoist Wu Wei. Um, he uh, he pushes this idea of psychedelic soul, which combines exploring the mind and the body without judgment in order to heal oneself. And one way that somebody can heal oneself from this theory would be through Dr. Funkenstein, who's an extraterrestrial that came to Earth to heal those separated from their own funk. And so this is a short clip from, I'm going to take a look at a part of the Dr. Funkenstein's live album. This is Dr. Funkenstein landing on Earth. And um, yeah, just see what it feels like watching it. All right, so just a little short taste of that funk. And so essentially within the cosmology of Funkadelic, you have Star Child, who's on the right, coming to bring healing and unity through funk. And on the left, you have the evil Sir Nose devoid of funk, whose name is self-explanatory and encourage the part of oneself that motivates one to not tap into the spontaneous generation of feelings and thoughts and movements and creation. And so these characters played out by the band spoke to collective and individual fears and desires in society and the psyche. They seem to go directly against the Freudian DSM behavioral psychology trend that was rising in popularity in the country. Many themes seem to start from the Freudian ideas of id and pleasure principle, but encourage a connection to it and exploration of it instead of a way to rid oneself of it. And so it's kind of like a Luke Skywalker, Dark Vader type of dynamic. And finally, we need to have more laughter. So humor has shares prefixes with things like human, humane, and humility, words that we love. Humor facilitates the processing of complex emotions and psychological material in a unique way. It reminds us of our humanity. It reminds us of others' humanity. It allows us to humanize others in a world where we're primed to dehumanize them. It allows us to humility, to step outside of our egos. Adults with shared vision of the future allow for enough social structure and buffer to allow for children to play through funk and humor with a refreshing level of freedom. Um, and so those are the rights of inheritance of future generations. And this is what I'm putting forward as some things that might help our society out. Um, and it seems complex, it seems long, it seems difficult, right? It's not fun in some cases, unless you add the humor aspect. And so I'm going to finish with this quote, which is from the Dalai Lama, again, the Book of Joy. And that is, people would like to be able to take a pill that makes their fear and anxiety go away and makes them immediately feel peaceful. This is impossible. One must develop the mind over time and cultivate mental immunity. Often people ask me for the quickest and best solution to a problem. Again, this is impossible. You can have the quickest or you can have the best solution, but not both. And so the goal is to find the best solution to take our country out of the dark night of our soul and have the courage through multicolored ripple effects in healthy environments to lean in towards love and hope again. And so this is the final Ghanaian symbol that I'm going to show, which means those led by love will never lose their way. And so these are ideas, right, that are not central values for honest in American society, but taking values that are central in other societies and incorporating it into our modern situation can possibly do magical wonders for us in terms of finding solutions because we need help so that we can get to a place where we feel more connected again, despite what we look like or where we come from. And these are some of the references that I have. Thank you very much.